Julian was settling into his new home, enjoying the peace and quiet of the woods. But one night, strange noises from his backyard shattered the calm. At first, he brushed them off as typical wildlife sounds, but then he saw it. The deer. It wasn't like any deer he had ever seen, moving with an almost purposeful grace. Compelled by something he couldn't explain, Julian followed it into the woods, only to stumble upon a mystery that would change everything, one that no one could have foreseen. Welcome to Limelight Tales. Is the deer a warning or a guide? Uncover the mystery lurking in the woods. Julian had always considered himself a practical man, never one to entertain wild ideas. His cabin, nestled in the woods on the outskirts of a small town, was his refuge from the noise and chaos of city life. The occasional rustle in the trees or the hoot of an owl was nothing out of the ordinary. But for the past few weeks there had been a strange noise coming from his backyard at night. At first, Julian dismissed it as the usual sounds of wildlife, maybe a raccoon or a deer wandering too close to his property. But the sounds grew more distinct, more deliberate. The soft thudding of hooves, followed by a series of faint, quick thumps, almost like a signal, had started to nag at him. It was as if something was trying to get his attention. One particularly stormy night, the noises grew louder, more urgent. Julian sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling. The rain lashed against the windows, but beneath it he could still hear the strange thumping. His curiosity finally overtook his hesitation, and he grabbed his flashlight. With a sigh, he slipped into his jacket, knowing he wouldn't be able to rest until he checked it out. Outside, the rain fell in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees. He stepped carefully into the backyard, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. There was no sign of the usual wildlife, no raccoons or skunks rustling in the bushes. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A large deer stood near the edge of his yard, its coat sleek and dark against the backdrop of trees. At first glance, it seemed ordinary enough, but its posture was strange. Its head was tilted to the side, and its eyes glinted with an unnatural intelligence. It didn't run off like the others usually did. Instead, it stared at him, unblinking, almost as if it was waiting for something. Julian froze, his flashlight beam shaking slightly. The deer stamped its hoof once, then twice, in quick succession, before it suddenly darted off into the trees, looking back as though urging him to follow. For a moment, Julian hesitated. His logical mind told him to stay inside, to ignore this strange behavior. But something deep inside tugged at him. Was it a sign? Was the deer trying to tell him something? Compelled by an instinct he couldn't quite explain, Julian decided to follow. He stepped forward cautiously, using his flashlight to guide the way. The deer didn't stray far. It paused just ahead, glancing back as if ensuring he was still behind. It led him deeper into the woods, farther than Julian had ventured before. The trees loomed like shadows, their branches swaying wildly in the storm, but the deer seemed undisturbed, its movements graceful and sure. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small hidden clearing. The deer stopped abruptly, its eyes fixed on a patch of earth near the base of an old, gnarled oak tree. Julian knelt, shining his flashlight on the ground. There, half buried in the dirt, was a piece of metal, rusted, broken, and unmistakably man-made. He cleared the dirt around it, revealing more of the wreckage. It looked like it had been deliberately concealed. His mind raced. The wreckage looked too old to be from a recent crash, but it was impossible to ignore the sense that something was off. Julian knew of a plane that had gone missing years ago. a local tragedy that had never been fully explained. Was this wreckage from that plane? He carefully examined the pieces, his heart sinking as he realized that this wasn't just some forgotten relic of a crash. It was too clean, too deliberately hidden. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep it buried. Before he could process what this discovery meant, he heard something, the faint sound of voices. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly stood up, trying to remain unseen. The deer was already moving again, but this time its movements were faster, more urgent. It glanced back at him once, then bolted into the trees, pushing him to follow once more. Julian's heart raced as he chased after it, barely keeping up. The deer led him to the edge of the clearing, where a small cabin stood, almost hidden from view by the thick underbrush. The storm had obscured the building, but as Julian approached, he saw a dim light flickering through the windows. He approached cautiously, not sure who or what was inside. Suddenly, the door to the cabin creaked open, and a man emerged. He was tall, with a rugged appearance, dressed in worn but practical clothing, and carrying what appeared to be a large pack over his shoulder. He looked at Julian with suspicion, his eyes narrowing as if trying to place him. Julian opened his mouth to speak, but the man beat him to it. "What are you doing here?" His voice was rough, but there was a strange calmness to it. I followed the deer," Julian stammered, pointing behind him. "It led me here." The man blinked, then laughed, shaking his head. "You must be lost. This deer you're talking about, she's not what you think." Julian was taken aback. "You know the deer?" "More than you could imagine." The man's tone darkened. "You're not the first person to stumble onto this place, but I'm a wildlife conservationist. I can explain everything." Julian frowned. "A conservationist? I found wreckage, hidden wreckage in the woods. It's connected to a plane crash from years ago." The man's eyes narrowed again, but this time Julian noticed a flicker of something, fear maybe behind them. "I told you," the man said, his voice now tight with warning. "That wreckage was planted. It's a trap. Someone's trying to frame us." Julian was stunned. "Frame you? What do you mean?" Before he could respond, the deer emerged from the trees again, her presence as calm as ever. The man looked at her with a strange mixture of respect and wariness. "You should go back home. This isn't a place for you to be involved in." Julian's mind was racing. The wreckage, the strange deer, this man's cryptic words. It didn't add up. He had to know more. But as the man's gaze hardened, Julian realized that the answers he was searching for weren't going to be handed to him so easily. Julian stood there, staring at the wildlife conservationist, his mind spinning. The man's warning echoed in his ears, but something about the whole situation felt off. His eyes drifted to the deer, which stood motionless just beyond the cabin, its head lowered, but its gaze never leaving Julian. "I don't understand," Julian said, trying to make sense of it all. "You say that wreckage was planted, but who would do that, and why? And what does this deer have to do with any of it?" The conservationist let out a long, slow breath, as if debating whether or not to tell Julian more. Finally, he spoke. "That wreckage wasn't just hidden. It was meant to send a message. There are people out there who want to control the land, to exploit it. The wreckage, the deer, it's all connected to something much bigger than you realize, and you're getting too close to the truth." Julian's stomach churned. "What truth?" The conservationist took a step back, his hand brushing the cabin door as if to retreat. "The land you're living on. It was once part of a secret government facility. They were conducting experiments on animal intelligence, on the animals in these woods. The deer you see here, it's one of them. They were trained, manipulated, but they also learned. They became more aware than you can imagine. Julian's mind was racing. The man was talking about government experiments? Animal intelligence? It sounded insane, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the pieces were starting to fit together. The strange behaviors of the deer, the urgency with which it had led him into the woods, it all pointed to something deliberate. "You're saying this deer is part of that?" Julian asked, his voice almost a whisper. The conservationist nodded slowly. "Yes, and it's been protecting you from the moment you arrived. You don't know it, but you're a target. Those people who were involved in the trafficking, they'll do whatever it takes to keep their secrets safe." Julian felt a chill run down his spine. "Trafficking? What are you talking about?" "The poachers," the conservationist said, lowering his voice. "They're not just after animals. They're after something far more valuable: information. They've been using these tunnels beneath your cabin to smuggle rare animals to cover up their crimes. The wreckage was a diversion. They didn't expect you to find it." The gravity of the situation hit Julian all at once. He was caught in the middle of something far darker than he could have imagined. He turned to look at the deer, which was still standing in the distance, watching him. I don't know what to believe anymore," Julian admitted, his voice shaky. "Everything's so messed up." The conservationist's expression softened for a moment, but then his gaze hardened again. "You need to leave. Now! You've seen too much already." Just as Julian opened his mouth to protest, the deer made a sudden move. It started walking toward him, but with an intensity this time, its movements sharp and urgent. It stopped a few feet away, its eyes locking onto his, and then it turned sharply, heading back toward the woods. Julian hesitated, but something inside him told him to follow. The deer had always been his guide, even when he didn't understand why. He glanced back at the conservationist, who stood watching him with a look of warning. "Don't follow it," the man called after him. "It's leading you into danger." But Julian couldn't stop himself. He trusted the deer more than he trusted this stranger. The animal had been guiding him through the unknown, leading him closer to answers. It wasn't wrong. He could feel it deep inside. He followed the deer deeper into the woods, his mind racing. The storm had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like something was about to break. The deer led him to the edge of a cliff, where a hidden entrance was revealed, an overgrown path that led downward. Julian's heart raced as he realized what it was. The tunnels, the underground network the conservationist had mentioned. The deer stepped into the opening without hesitation, and Julian followed. The tunnel was narrow, damp, and eerily quiet. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, winding through the labyrinth of underground passages until they reached a small chamber. Here, in the dim light, Julian saw something that made his blood run cold. Beneath the earth, hidden away from the world, was a network of cages, each one containing rare and endangered animals. But they weren't just any animals. These were creatures from all over the world, animals that had been taken, trafficked, and locked away in these tunnels. And there, in the center of the room, was a pile of documents, maps, records, photographs, all connecting the local landowners to the illegal trafficking operation. The deer stood still beside him, its gaze steady and unblinking. Julian realized with horror that this was the truth the deer had been guiding him to. The government facility, the animal intelligence experiments, the wildlife trafficking. It was all part of a much larger, more sinister operation. But just as the realization hit, the ground beneath his feet shook. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the tunnel. A voice came from behind him. "Thought you could escape the truth?" Julian spun around to see the conservationist standing in the entrance of the chamber, a smirk playing across his lips. He wasn't the conservationist he had claimed to be. He was part of the network, the one who had been controlling the operation all along. "Everything you've seen, everything you've learned," the man said, his voice cold. "It's too late now." Julian felt a surge of panic, but before he could react, the deer charged at the man with incredible force, knocking him to the ground. The man struggled, but the deer didn't relent, standing over him with an intense, protective stance. In that moment, Julian understood. The deer had always been protecting him, not just from the poachers, but from the very people who had created this hellish operation. And now, the deer had made sure the truth would never be buried again. As the man lay on the ground, the deer turned back to Julian. Its eyes once again locked with his. It nodded once, then turned, heading toward the exit. Julian, his heart pounding in his chest, followed. The deer had led him through the darkness, and now it was guiding him toward the light, toward a future where he could expose the truth. The world might never believe him, but he knew one thing for sure. The deer had been his protector, his guide, all along. And now, it was his turn to protect the truth. Julian stood in the chamber, his mind racing as the reality of the situation settled over him. The conservationist, no, the man was something far worse, lay unconscious on the floor, the deer standing sentinel over him. The sudden clarity that hit Julian made him feel both empowered and terrified. The deer wasn't just guiding him to uncover the truth. It had been protecting him from the very beginning. He took one last look at the network of cages, the imprisoned animals, and the incriminating documents scattered on the floor. There was no denying it now. He had found the heart of an illegal operation that spanned far beyond anything he could have imagined. The connections between the local landowners, the government facility, and the traffickers were all laid out before him, in a twisted web of greed and cruelty. Julian knew he couldn't just walk away. The truth had to be exposed. He quickly gathered the evidence, photos, documents, and anything that could prove the scale of the trafficking operation. The deer watched him silently, its posture unchanging, as if it understood the gravity of what he was about to do. He stepped over the unconscious man and hurried back through the tunnels, the deer leading the way. As they emerged into the woods, Julian felt the weight of his decision. The deer had trusted him to uncover the truth, but now it was his responsibility to bring it to light. The storm had cleared, and the first rays of dawn began to pierce through the trees. The world felt different now. He wasn't the same man who had stepped into the woods the night before. He had uncovered something far more dangerous than he could have imagined, but he also knew that the deer, this incredible creature, had kept him safe from it all. When Julian returned to his cabin, he immediately contacted the authorities. He told them everything: the wreckage, the underground network, the traffickers, and sent them the evidence he had gathered. It didn't take long for the truth to spread. The authorities launched a full investigation, and soon the poachers and the corrupt landowners were brought to justice. But as Julian watched the news coverage of the arrests and the operation's dismantling, something didn't sit right with him. He hadn't heard anything about the deer. No mention of the creature that had saved his life, led him to the truth, and made everything possible. He knew it wouldn't make sense to anyone, but Julian also knew that it didn't matter. The deer had always been more than just an animal. It had been his guide, his protector, and the key to unraveling a dark and dangerous conspiracy. The world would never know the full story. A week later, as Julian sat on his porch, reflecting on everything that had happened. He saw a familiar figure at the edge of the trees. The deer stood there, watching him with those intelligent, knowing eyes. For a moment, they locked gazes, as if silently acknowledging everything that had transpired. Then, without a sound, the deer turned and disappeared into the woods as silently as it had come into his life. Julian knew he would never forget the role the deer had played in saving not just his life, but the lives of countless others. He also knew that his time in the woods had changed him forever. He had uncovered a dark truth, but he had also learned that the world was full of mysteries, and some of them were far more profound than anyone could ever understand. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Julian felt a sense of peace settle over him. The deer had done its job. Now, it was time for him to continue his own. In a world where danger often lurks beneath the surface, sometimes the answers we seek are guided by forces we can't fully understand. In the quietest corners, where mystery and truth intertwine, the bond between human and nature can become a silent protector, steering us toward the right path, even when we're blind to its significance. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, and subscribe. Stay curious. Sometimes the answers are closer than we think.